Good evening, and thank you so much for attending this community collaboration event with Film Streams and the Willa Cather Foundation. My name is Rachel Olsen, and I am the Director of Education and Engagement at the National Willa Cather Center in Red Cloud, Nebraska. I'm delighted to speak with Isaac Chung, the director of tonight's film, MINARI. A son of Korean immigrants, Isaac Chung grew up on a small farm in rural Arkansas and then attended Yale University before abandoning plans for medical school to earn his MFA in film studies at the University of Utah. Chung's latest film, Twisters, starring Daisy Edgar Jones, Glenn Powell, and Anthony Ramos, follows the group as they find themselves squarely in the paths of multiple storm systems converging over central Oklahoma in the fight of their lives. Distributed by Universal Pictures domestically and Warner Brothers Pictures internationally, the film opened on July 19th of this year. His breakout film, MINARI from Plan B and A24, won the Grand Jury and Audience Award at Sundance in 2020 and garnered Golden Globe and Critics' Choice wins, along with multiple Academy Award, Independent Spirit, BAFTA, and SAG nominations. The film was named one of the 10 best films of 2020 by the American Film Institute and by the National Board of Review, which also awarded Isaac Best Original Screenplay. Chung's other films include Munya Rungabo, which premiered in 2007 at the Cannes Film Festival to critical acclaim, Lucky Life, and Abigail Harm. Chung currently resides in Los Angeles with his wife and daughter. Isaac, thank you so much for speaking with us. It's a real pleasure to meet you.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. I wish I could be there in person. But glad to be joining you.
Well, someday if you make your way to Nebraska, now you know where to go. I think I wanted to start off our discussion tonight by asking you just to give sort of a broad overview of the influence Willa Cather had on your film MINARI. And some of the people in our audience tonight may not have read some of your earlier interviews or articles about the film. So can you talk a little bit about how you discovered Cather's writing? You mentioned My Antonia, and are there other Cather books that you have read? Paul, for instance, one of the characters in the film, seems very much like Ivar in Cather's 1913 novel, O Pioneers.
Yeah, I'm very embarrassed to say I wasn't that aware of Willa Cather's books for many, many years. And one day I was in a coffee shop and I was just trying to figure out what I was going to write next. And I really stilled my mind. And I was just sitting there and trying to see if anything would come to me, any word or anything like that. And Willa Cather, I felt like I just heard that name. And at the time, I was just not familiar with her. So I wondered, why is that name coming to me? What is that name? And I looked her up and saw, okay, yeah, she's one of our great novelists. And I thought, I'm going to go ahead and go down this thread here and try to read her books. And My Antonia was the first one that I read. And then I read, I think I read Death Comes for the Archbishop. And then the book about the professor, I read that one. And Oh Pioneers, Lost Lady. So I was kind of going on this kick of just reading her books at the South Pasadena Library. And I came across a quote of hers where she said her life really began when she stopped admiring and she started remembering. So there was a great volume of work that came from her once she gave herself permission to really write about her upbringing in rural Nebraska. And I found something very interesting in her story where she had come from Virginia and moved to Nebraska, or I think at least that's what's documented in My Antonia. I found that journey to be really interesting of this boy, Jim Burden. And I felt like I kind of went through something very similar. And then Antonia, I kind of identified with because she was the immigrant kid in that community. where her dad was trying to farm and it was very difficult. And I felt like we went through a similar process when we moved to Arkansas, where my dad and mom, they had a very different life in Korea, but now they were in the US and my dad was really trying to make it as a farmer. Something about that resonated with me. So I took that adage of hers of trying to remember rather than admire and applied that to my own life and started to write down my own memories. So there's a lot in there that is born from that influence. There's stuff in there that I peppered in that's a little bit of an homage to her as well. Like you find out that the previous owner had committed suicide, and that was something that came out of Antonia's father in the book. That was just a touch that I added in. And I have Willa Cather, her name on the moving van. It's like Cather Moving Company or something when the movie starts. So it's kind of the first thing you see in the film. But in terms of other, like Ivar, that's kind of a coincidence. I think she and I both just had very spiritual, people who are very eccentric in our lives, I suppose, that maybe informed that character. Because that man, Paul, was based on somebody in real life who helped my dad farm. And he was like an ex-con who, he was in prison in Boston, and then he decided to like start a new life and came to Arkansas, and he ended up becoming great friends with my dad, and they were such an unlikely pair that I wanted to infuse the film with a bit of that friendship and relationship. So that's where that came from.
I think that I've said to you that I too grew up in the Ozarks, and Paul also was very identifiable as a kind of an eccentric person in the Ozarks. If you're familiar with that part of the country. Well, and speaking of Arkansas and where MINARI is set, there's a distinct sense of place in the film. And again, as a person who also grew up in the Ozarks, I immediately recognized a lot of the settings, the sounds and the sights, and some of the sort of cultural landscape in the film. Why was it important for you to capture Arkansas on film in the way that you did? What do you want the audience to learn about Arkansas or the Ozarks as a place or a region that they might not otherwise learn?
Yeah, I do feel that when I see that part of the country represented in stories, it's often done in a way that is that kind of confirms a lot of stereotypes that people have about people and the culture there, and it doesn't necessarily talk about the landscape nor the nuances and complexity of people in the area. So it was, I think both of those things were very important for me. And going back to what I read in My Antonia, like when I was reading that, I just felt like I could sense that she had definitely come from that place and lived these experiences out. Even like the way that she would end chapters with this lovely, very modernist kind of, it's almost like expressionistic words about what the landscape is doing as the sun is setting. And, these moments that she's just capturing where it's almost like she's just remembering what it was like to live there and to experience those things as a child. I even think about the episodes that she has with the snake, the rattlesnake. And that's something that that resonated with me just growing up. Like that's part of my framework when I remember farm life, that snakes were a big part of like something I would be looking out for as I go to the woods, and something that I would see often. So as I was making this film, I just wanted it to reflect that feeling of a place that's lived in, that I've lived in, that I definitely remember, and to capture it with a real beauty that I see in it. So I think it really came out of my own memory and my own affection for the place.
Well, I think Cather's affection for Nebraska is very hard won. She was not happy to live here as a 10-year-old or 9-year-old girl coming from Virginia. I would liken her sort of impressions of Nebraska to Monica's in the film, just the kind of, where am I? What is this? There's very much a parallel there. Well, you bring up the snake in MINARI, and in My Antonia, Jim Burton also kills a snake while he's with Antonia, and it's a pretty memorable scene in the first part of the novel. In your film, David, the young boy in the family that's depicted, he is with his grandmother, and they are by the water, and he sees a snake, and he starts to throw a rock at it, and his grandmother says, don't make it run away. It's safer if we can see it. And then later, after the grandmother in your film suffers a stroke, she sort of, it's almost like she keeps going back to a prior conversation that she remembers right before her stroke. And she kind of acts as if she can see the snake in her bedroom. And she points at it, and David's sister Anne is confused and doesn't understand what's going on, but the audience knows. I think too, in earlier drafts of your script, there were maybe more scenes or a more extended scene involving a snake. So I wonder if you could talk about what the snake means in the context of the film, talk about that a little bit more, and how that differs from Cather's use of the snake as both a literal sort of event and a symbol. In the novel, Jim kills it and later finds out that it was an older snake, and if it had been younger and more energetic, he probably would have been in much more danger. And then he hangs the snake, I think, on the fence at his grandparents' house as kind of a trophy.
Yeah. And that, I always found that image to be quite an interesting image. But yeah, for me, I felt one of the earlier lines of dialogue in the film, Jacob kind of says that this is like the Garden of Eden or something like that. He compares the new farm to the Garden of Eden. So I feel I was running with that symbolism a lot with the film. It's meant to be, there's kind of a spiritual resonance to what's going on in that garden that I felt is meant to tie to that biblical story, but to play with it. I wanted to play with that story. And yeah, I had more moments of the snake, which that was tough to film because we actually filmed those scenes and had a snake wrangler, and we would let the snake go inside of the house, and it would head towards the cameraman, and he would kind of freak out a little bit. So we definitely we definitely did the hard work of filming it, but I felt like at a certain point the symbolism started to get a little too heavy without enough explanation for it. I felt like we weren't earning it in our edit, and the way that I wanted to preserve it was to let it feel like more of an internal, subjective thing that the grandmother is going through, and something that can also feel foreboding for the audience, because in many ways the story is set up so that you kind of fall in love with this family in the first half, and in the second half I start to make it feel as though something really ominous and bad is going to happen. And I think a snake is actually quite a good way to do that. For some reason, we just have a feeling about snakes as people. But that actual line that she says in the creek about the snake and the rock, that is something that I took from Claude Wilkinson, a poet who's a friend of mine, who gave me permission to use that line. He has a poem called Baptism, where there's this community of people doing a baptism at a creek, and there's a snake watching them from overhead, and the boys almost throw a rock at it, but an elderly man says, or a woman, I believe it is, says, leave it be. It's better to see where it is. And I loved that poem, and I loved the sentiment of it. So that was just one of the stops along the way that we visited the snake story.
Well, and David and Anne's grandmother also, she seems to be sort of the environment, but she doesn't. She seems to try not to disrupt sort of the natural world in a way that I find really fascinating. She's growing MINARI by the creek, but it seems to sort of just blend in, and she's exploring, but she's not disrupting the environment around her, which I think is a very interesting way to think about her character.
Yeah, she's kind of more at one with the earth in many ways, is the way I feel about her, where with Jacob, there's a lot more toil. There's a lot more of trying to bend the earth to his will. Mm-hmm. And with her, things are coming more easily. So I think when Jacob says, wow, it's really growing well at the end, Grandma really picked a good spot. It's kind of, and then they are basically gathering there. It's almost like they're submitting to that kind of approach, in my view. I always loved that dichotomy between the two, and it came out of, in real life, my grandmother really did plant a patch of MINARI by a creek at our house, and when it was time to sell the farm, I remember reflecting with my parents that maybe that was the only crop that really grew very well on our land. And it was interesting because my grandmother kind of lived in a way that not many people knew about her existence. She didn't speak English. She was kind of just at home, hanging with us and watching us. But there are little things of wisdom and deep beauty that she was doing that of course I would notice much later.
Well, speaking of other kind of characterizations in the film, as you explained, MINARI is not a straight adaptation of My Antonia, but do you see any of the characters in your film as being Antonia's counterpart?
Well, I do think about her dad, and that there is that character is kind of within the film. In many ways, Jacob is also tormented. Mm-hmm. But I think Jacob, Antonia's dad, it kind of doesn't want to be there fully as well. Like he no. Seems like he's, yeah. So there is a big difference there. But I think everybody just gets wrapped up with each other in the film and the book. Like there are just nods to them, but there's no like straight
equivalent
count. Yeah, which I was very wary to do anything like that, given Willa Cather's desire for nobody to adapt her work, as we were talking about before we started to hit record on this.
Well, I happen to be in the camp that thinks it's okay to adapt her work, so you can file that away for future reference.
Maybe one day I will have the courage to try. I do love her work. Like it is so beautiful.
Well, I think that brings me to another question. A lot of your films really make use of literature or storytelling as kind of a central piece to your own filmmaking, whether it is Rwandan poetry or the deer and the woodcutter folk tale that is sort of the central text in Abigail Harm. So it seems like literature and stories are important to you. However, as we talked about earlier, anyone who studies Willa Cather is familiar with her feelings about her work being adapted into films. She was not interested, but her work seems very adaptable. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why you think adapting literature or including literature as some sort of illusion or plot device is such a vital component in your films and the films of other directors.
I guess I do like when one work is in conversation with another. I feel like that's always a great thing when it feels like an author decides to converse with another author in some respect, like a filmmaker decides to have a conversation with an author by taking that material and doing something new with it. I feel like Lucky Life, that film, that was based on Gerald Stern's poetry, a book that the poem Lucky Life, and also a lot of the poems within that book. And that felt to me, I enjoyed that process because I felt like I was taking his poetry and what his poetry meant to me, but I was still trying to keep it very personal. So I enjoyed that process quite a lot. And then with this one, Minari, I do feel like Willa Cather was my guide. You know, she was, that was the name, and that was the impetus for doing this film. So I wanted to be conversing with her and also trying to follow her approach, her footsteps for how she kind of went from her own discontent in what she was doing creatively to shifting focus to her life on the plains. You know, I felt like that was a great thing to try to take on myself. So just on a very personal level, it's almost as though I'm just very much aware of how important these authors are to me, and I want to not just exploit that, but to be in conversation with that. Mm-hmm. With Twisters, there's absolutely no literary component, so I'm very sorry, but yeah.
Well, but with Twisters, there's a rural component and a rural representation component. Maybe that's, I have a couple more questions if that's okay, and just to shift gears. In your New Yorker interview with Justin Chang, you talked about sort of the giant machinery of making a movie like Twisters. And the term you used to describe making Minari was crafting and perfecting. And so I guess I wonder what crafting and perfecting means in terms of independent filmmaking. And is that sort of a more expansive way to work, you know, making a smaller film? Or did you have that, you know, the kind of expansive experience making Twisters?
Yeah, I guess something I mean, one way I could clarify that is that with Minari, I could wrap my mind around the project more easily because it's a little bit more contained. There are a lot fewer characters, very few locations. We were filming within an actual mobile home, a single wide trailer almost the entire time, and there are only a few camera positions that you can even find within a space like that. So everything is very intentional in many ways and thought out. And there are just moments of improvisation and places where I can be loose. With Twisters, it just felt like it was a massive chaotic storm, like a big tornado. And I was just trying to really, I guess the way I would liken it is like a small film is like steering a rowboat or a speedboat, and you can make turns really quickly. And this one, it's like a massive aircraft carrier where I have to know how to turn, like, 3 days before we're gonna be turning, just because it takes that much effort. So there's a lot that also slips through in many ways that I have a harder time watching Twisters than Minari. Like with Minari, I feel like, okay, I did it. I did the things I set out to do. With Twisters, there's a lot of like, okay, next time I know, how to tackle that and stuff like that. But it's just the nature of the beast. And then with Twisters, there was such more of an urgent need to meet this release date for the studio, and you feel that industrial quality, if you will, of it. Whereas Minari, it's much more personal, where who knows if anyone's going to watch it, but let's try to make it as good as it can be. We can spend some time on certain things. So there was that aspect too that's very different.
Will you make Central Oklahoma look very beautiful, just as you do with rural Arkansas. So I feel like that's worth noting.
I appreciate that. Thank you. It's not hard to make it look beautiful, I gotta say.
Well, okay. Agreed. In you wrote a piece for the LA Times when MINARI came out, and I want to kind of, both Twisters and MINARI again deal with rural places and people. And in your LA Times piece, you wrote, "Insecurities and missteps can plague writers and artists who come from rural places. We worry that our provincial life experiences won't gain the approval of urban curators, so we assimilate ourselves to other, more sophisticated voices." Having written that, do you see rural representation in film evolving in any specific way? And I wonder how can rural artists sort of start to shift or continue to shift the power balance to assume a more active role in kind of being their own curators for audiences outside of rural communities?
Yeah, that's such a great question that I don't know the answers fully to, because I'm in process with that myself. And part of it is such an internal battle for me because, I grew up in a very rural place, and I grew up outside of the quote unquote city limits of a town of like 1,300 people, and I was on a farm. And once I got to college on the East Coast, it was a very elite education, and I had dreamt of going there. Like I dreamt of going to the Ivy League, because in all the books I was reading, it just seemed like it's such a romantic life, and I wanted to travel. And professionally, I felt like there was nothing for me in Lincoln, Arkansas, and I felt like a lot of that battle was happening within, so it wasn't necessarily coming from the outside. But there is a reality in which a lot of people who are green-lighting projects or who are, I don't know if it's different in the literary world, but a lot of people who are the gatekeepers did grow up in very privileged or urban or suburban backgrounds. And there is maybe not as much of a nuanced understanding of what life is like in rural places. And you kind of start to wonder as an artist from a rural place, who am I writing or who am I working for? One of the things that I've tried to do in my work, starting with the film I did in Rwanda, is to really keep in mind who my audience is. And with that first film, I really felt like I want to make a movie for people in Rwanda during that time that I made that film, which was 2008. And then I think I kind of went away from that, where I started to think more about making films that will do well at film festivals, at very urbane places. And this is where some of that inner turmoil was happening for me as I was gaining some notice as a filmmaker. But with MINARI and with Twisters as well, like I shifted my attention of who my audience is. And I think a lot about people I grew up with, or, my family from Arkansas. And just having an honest shift like that has really helped. And I've just noticed that in meetings, I just have to kind of stand up for certain things that I know will work well in Arkansas, in rural Arkansas, and provide like a firm belief and conviction for the fact that we need to try to do these things. For instance, what I mean is, like with Twisters, sometimes the studio felt that the stakes are not high enough because it's a small town that's being destroyed. And I said, we need to make it clear that those are high stakes, that's not a small thing. I feel like people from small towns get that and understand that and are frustrated by that idea that these are small stakes. So I think rural artists have a chance to be able to speak their own reality and understanding of what it's like to be in those places to people, but never to do it in a combative way. I try not to do that, but I do feel like having conviction is an important thing.
Well, thank you for that. I think in Twisters and MINARI as well, there's definitely a sense that rural communities are portrayed in a way that's not stereotypical, or that's, maybe complicated in ways that somebody who didn't grow up in a rural area or live in a rural place for a long time maybe wouldn't pick up on. So do with that sort of validation what you will.
Oh, thank you. That's really great. Yeah, thank you.
Well, I have one more question just to end on, because I know we're talking about film, and I know a lot of film lovers are going to watch this interview. You've spoken in other interviews and articles about sort of valuing the physical and sensory experience of going to the movies and going to a movie theater. And I know in preparation for this talk, I really enjoyed watching films that I thought might connect to your films. I watched Days of Heaven, and I thought about Wong Kar-wai and some 90s independent films that remind me of MINARI. But do you have any thoughts about the future of moviegoing for our audience tonight, and what you would like to see happen in the future?
Yeah, I just came off of this run right now of promoting Twisters, and I feel like I've been saying to audiences and to journalists that I really hope that movie theaters survive. I really love that space as a place for us to have screens that are much bigger than these small things that we kind of get lost into, our phones. And I feel like these communal experiences of things that are bigger than us, they're very rare. And I'm hoping that we can preserve something of that experience. So I've kind of put it on myself to think about how I can help foster that as a filmmaker. How do I make sure that I'm making films that have an excuse, that need to be seen in a movie theater? And that's all I could really hope to do. In terms of culturally what's going to happen, I don't know. As it does seem like film watching is becoming much more fragmented. People are watching TV or series more, streaming, and people, I watch young people watching things on these small screens all the time that are much shorter in length as well. And I don't know, I'm a bit of an old school guy and wanting to preserve what I love about this craft. And hopefully I can show that. I can show why I think it's important. I'll let the work do the talking. I guess that's what I'd like to do.
Well, I think that's a great sentiment to end on. Lee Isaac Chung, thank you so much for joining me tonight. And thank you for MINARI and Twisters and your work.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rachel. And thank you to the Willa Cather Foundation. I really appreciate all the support. I've been here getting emails from you all, and I so appreciated that support. I love that we have this in common, this admiration for this author. And just thank you to everybody who tuned in to watch this and to watch the film. Thank you.
Thank you.